somebody posting that for us. And hopefully everybody can hear now. If you can give me a thumbs up or something on Facebook, so I apologize for that, but we've got it cleared up now. So we are studying Revelation. We're going to be talking about, is Revelation real? That's what the study is going to be about tonight. We last week were studying, is this the end of the world? And in that study, we talked about several different passages that people are floating around and talking about and questioning. And so, in that case, somebody, in fact, it was Amy Napier, said maybe we should study the book of Revelation and give an overview of that book. And I thought that was a great idea. And so, I see still some comments of no sound. I'm going to double check and make sure everybody's hearing. So I did turn up the sound. We should be getting sound through now. So if you can give me some thumbs up on Facebook, just so I know. I see a thumbs up through Zoom. I see Elizabeth has joined us. Can you hear us okay with a thumbs up? All right. Sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties there with this new technology. So we're studying the book of Revelation. All right. So as I mentioned, people are experiencing lots of emotions right now, and they're questioning their faith. They're starting to pray. They're starting to open their Bibles. And that excites me. I'm glad to see people opening their Bibles. And what's interesting is that usually when people open their Bibles and they start trying to figure out their Bibles, they start to go to Revelation. I remember whenever we were in South America and in Central America and trying to study with different people, and everybody was always interested in Revelation. They always wanted to know about the book of Revelation. You know, and it's fascinating. There's descriptions of the beasts, of these strange scenes, the 144,000, the end of the world, and the apocalypse, and all this stuff. And so it makes people ask, is Revelation for real? What does all this mean? What is it? What are we supposed to do with this? Well, unfortunately, there is a ton of information out there. You can find articles and blogs and books and all kinds of sermons and details about the book of Revelation. Now, the reason I say unfortunately is because a lot of the things that are out there are just false. There is not truth to a lot of what they say. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation that's confused people. There's a lot of false doctrines that's come out of the book of Revelation. And so tonight I want to look at the book in an overview and just kind of help you understand what Revelation is about. Now, I'm certainly not saying that I know everything there is to know about the book of Revelation. I'm certainly not saying that I'm the only one who understands it, because there's many who do. There's many in the church. There's even people in the denominational world that understand a lot of the book of Revelation. In fact, you can understand the book of Revelation if you just simply apply common logic and reason along with simple rules of grammar and literature. It's not exactly easy. It's not done quickly, and it requires some work and some diligence, but you can understand this book. And so, in fact, I would say no one really is an expert on Revelation. So this highlights some of the difficulty of the book of Revelation and why it's important to study and understand it. So what I want to do is tonight I want to give you an overview, 10 points of the book of Revelation. Preachers' alliteration. Preachers love alliteration. And so I want to give you a general panorama of the book, and then we're going to look at who the penman was, the period in which it's placed, the public, the place, and as well as we're going to look at the provocation for its writing, the purpose, and the principle behind it. And then we will close out by looking at a plan and the principal passages of the book. Just an overall view. It's all interconnected, and none of these are necessarily in a specific order. In fact, you can do these in different ways. But I want to look at these different points. And one of the first things I want to tell you is there's a very valuable book that if you don't have, I would recommend for your library. It's this book here. It's called Know Your Bible by Frank Dunn. Know Your Bible by Frank Dunn. And it's basically an overview of every book of the Bible and just does an outstanding job. He's a preacher, was a preacher in the Church of Christ for many years. And so that is a book that's very valuable. And so I would recommend that. Now, some of the stuff I want to be sharing with you tonight goes beyond even what's in that book. So let's start. Let's begin by Panorama. And I see now some of the comments of people are saying that they do have sound now. So again, I apologize for those who first signed on and there was no sound. So let's start taking notes. Let's look at the book of Revelation. The first thing we want to notice is overall panorama. So that means just an overview. So the name Revelation is right there in the very first verse of the book. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants. And so this word revelation is actually in the Greek word, the word apocalypsis. Does that sound familiar? Apocalypsis. Apocalypse. That's where that word comes from. And so when people talk about the apocalypse, they may not realize that that's actually the word for revelation. That's what the word revelation is. And so that means apocalypsis or revelation means an uncovering, a disclosure, an unveiling. And so when you think about revelation, it is revealing. It is opening up. In fact, it's revealing the person, the purpose, and the power of Jesus Christ. The whole book is about Jesus. And so that's what we see here is this unveiling, if you will, revealing of it. Listen, Revelation is unlike any book that's in the Bible. That's because it is full of apocalyptic language. Now what that means is it means symbols, it means imagery and signs. It also means that it has all kinds of figurative language. It's full of all kinds of things like numbers and objects and places and animals. All of that, brethren and friends, is for dramatic effect. Please don't ever forget that. That's the purpose of figurative language. It's for dramatic effect. It's for a highly visual or memorable effect. You're going to remember these characters or this imagery more so than if Jesus were to reveal it just in normal terms, I guess you could say. So a lot of this also, it's important to understand, is also borrowed from the Old Testament. In fact, from prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. In fact, of the 404 verses of the book of Revelation, 265 contain Old Testament language. What does that tell you? It tells you need to know the Bible if you really want to understand Revelation. That's something that I have preached and said many times whenever I teach the book of Revelation. If you really want to understand Revelation, you need to understand the entire Bible. You need to read the entire Bible because it has a lot of Old Testament history in there, all those references to the prophets, the language that the prophets use. For example, those beasts and things like that. Revelation is not the first time we see that type of language. The first time we see it is in places like Ezekiel or in Daniel or even in Isaiah. And so it's important to understand the Bible before you go studying the book of Revelation because it also brings in New Testament church history and things like that. Now, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. It's quite interesting that Revelation, being the end of the Bible, is also related to and connected to the beginning of the Bible, which is Genesis. Genesis is the book of beginnings. And what we see in Genesis and Revelation is a comparison as well as a contrast. You see things, for example, in Genesis, you see the first heaven and earth being created. And then in Revelation, you see the last heaven and earth. And then you also in Genesis see the creation of the sun and the moon. In Revelation, you see where the sun and the moon is not needed anymore. In Genesis, you see Satan gaining a victory over man. Whereas in Revelation, you see God gaining that ultimate victory over Satan. Then also in Genesis, you see paradise being shut to man, man being kicked out, and that being closed off. Whereas in Revelation, you see man being able to come into this new paradise, this new Jerusalem. you see different things like the tree of life, that tree of knowledge of good and evil in Genesis, and then you see the tree of life beside the waters in Revelation. So there's all these comparisons to Genesis as well as the end of the Bible, Revelation. And also another point of this panorama is the fact that this is also a spiritual book. Now, a lot of people forget that Genesis is spiritual. They're spiritual things. So when it talks about, for example, it's often called the book of wars. Some 9 times wars are talked about, or these scenes of wars are shown in the book of Revelation. Well, all of that has to do with spiritual war, not these physical wars that a lot of people like to attribute to the book of Revelation. And so what we see are these conflict, these scenarios between good and evil, between God and Satan, between the Lamb and dragon, between the bride and the harlot, between the New Jerusalem and Babylon. And I love what Brother Dunn says in his book. He says, God never makes peace with sin, but will ultimately destroy sin and restore everlasting peace with his people. So ultimately, God wins in the end. And so John reveals, this revelation reveals this imagery of Jesus Christ and who he is. So that's the first one. That's panorama. The second one is the penman. Who wrote the book of Revelation? Well, if you look right there in the first verse, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place, and he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. And then if you look in verse 9, you see, I, John, both your brother and companion in the tribulation, in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was on the island that is called Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ. And so we see that the penman, the person who wrote this, is John. This is the Apostle John. John is believed, and evidence shows that he is the last living apostle that actually walked with Jesus. One of those 12 apostles, that he was the last living apostle. Now the author of this book is God, and we see that in the first verse. God gave him through Jesus Christ, through the Spirit, through John, through an angel, it says, through John. So you see that level of communication through there. So that's the penman. Number 3, we have the period. And so the period is, well, there's questions about this. There's 2 camps when it comes to Revelation. There are, when I say camps, there are people who believe that Revelation is centered and written around just before AD 70, before the destruction of Jerusalem. And all this took place right around the destruction of Jerusalem. There's also another camp, if you will, or other people who believe that this was written about 94 to 96 AD, after the destruction. Now, both are interesting, and both can largely be substantiated, but the fact is, no one really knows for sure. No one really knows exactly when this book was written. And so those are 2 of the theories and the studies that are out there, either before the destruction of Jerusalem or afterwards. Now, the one afterward does have a lot of support, and that is from things that we read in history. For example, one of the historians, Irenaeus, says, because it was seen a short time ago that almost in our days, towards the end of kingdom of Domitian, talking about this apocalyptic vision. And we know that Domitian reigned between 81 AD and 96 AD. He also wrote the church in Ephesus, found by Paul, by which John remained among them permanently until the time of Trajan in 98 to 117 AD. As a true witness, he says, of these to the apostles. And so there's some of this evidence that it was written after the destruction of Jerusalem, during the second time of persecution. Now, when you talk about period, the time period, this is also the Christian dispensation. This is not in the Old Testament. This is New Testament, during New Testament Christianity. And much of it is written in reference to current time and events. I want you to pay attention, and a lot of people miss this. Verse 1, once again, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servant, things which must shortly take place. And then again in verse 3, these things that the time is near. Now, there's a lot of people that look at Revelation and want to say that it is for future. We have people that are teaching today that all the fulfillment of the prophecies of Revelation are taking place now. And it really, if you stop and think about that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because why would John write this for somebody 2,000 years later? Instead, the people who received this letter, seeing that this is shortly to take place, can identify the things that are in this letter, in this revelation, in order to be able to gain comfort from it. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute. So the time frame is also really important, the period we're talking about in the book of Revelation. And so it was under that time, whenever there was persecution, whether it was the first persecution with Nero or the second persecution of Domitian, this is a time period that is written for people that were Christians that were under persecution, which is one of the purposes of the book. And that brings us to our fourth point, and that is the public. This has to do with who it was written to. You see, when you're studying the Bible, you need to always ask questions like who's writing it, who are they writing to, and all the different things, all the different questions that you need to ask about when, where, why, and all that. That's what these questions are, or these points are that I'm giving you about the book of Revelation. Hopefully we'll answer. And so one of those is very specific audience. This book is written to a very specific audience. And we get that, if you will, look in chapter 1. In chapter 1, you see Jesus walking through the churches, if you will. Verse 18, I am he who lives and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. I have the keys of Hades and death. Write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. The mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in my right hand, the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands which you saw are the 7 churches. And then, in the next chapter, he says, to the angel of the church of Ephesus write. And then he goes on in verse 8 of chapter 2, to the angel of the church of Smyrna write. And he continues that for the next 2 chapters. So that is one of the specific audiences of this book. And that is the fact that Jesus is revealing these things, and he wants those 7 churches to understand what he says, what he is seeing, what he wants them to know. And so that's very important to understand when you think about who this is being written to. Now, this is also being written to Christians. That's why we have where it says, blessed is he who hears these things. It's written to Christians, and it's written to give them hope. That's one of the key things about Revelation, and we need to understand that this was written to provide hope for people that were going through persecution. And so really, it's written for them, but it's also written for Christians of all ages. Because we're still in the Christian age, and we're still experiencing, in some cases, or in many cases, these same things. This persecution. There's people in the world today, Christians in the world today, that are experiencing persecution. And so this is timeless in one sense. The fact that it still speaks to us today, still applicable to us today. But then again, it was written to a very specific group for our learning and to help us learn as well. I see some more have joined us on Zoom. Glad to have you with us. All right, so the 5th point we want to look at is the place. And that is where this belongs. It is in the New Testament era. It is during the Roman Empire. And that's why we have all this prophetic language. It is specifically talking about, though, when you talk about place, it's talking about things in the spiritual realm. Yes, he talks to those 7 churches in Asia, but everything that he talks about has to do with spiritual things. And then whenever you get into chapter 4, and from then on, it's all spiritual. It's all the things that you can see. John is seeing heavenly visions and things like that, taking us into this spiritual realm. He's seeing these glimpses of heaven and the worship in heaven. He's seeing a raging war taking place in this spiritual realm. He's seeing final judgment, all those different things that shows us a very specific place that this is happening. I want you to think about the letter of Corinth that Paul writes. Well, we can specify, well, that was in a certain city in Greece, or you might pick some other letter or some other book, and you can see, for example, Isaiah was writing in the kingdom of Judah whenever it was the divided kingdom, and then he's writing to those in captivity. Those all have to do with place. In this case, the book of Revelation, it does mention those 7 churches, but the overall place, if you will, is in the spiritual realm, talking about things that are spiritual. All right, so number 6, provocation. What provoked John to write the book of Revelation? What caused him to write this book? Well, if you go back once again and you look at verse 1 that we've read a few times, it is that revelation that Jesus gives to him, that he wants him to have. And then as we saw in verse 11, he says to write these things down in a book, to write them down. He says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. What you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And so he is to give an account of the things that he is about to see. And chapters 2 and chapters 3 are that reason whenever you see that he says, he who hath an ear to hear, and he explains all these things to these 7 churches. Now, a great lesson that we can take from those 7 churches is that every congregation that has ever existed or ever will exist fits into one of these categories right here. You see all the different types of congregations. You see those that are hot, if you will. They're very busy. Those that are cold. In other words, they're not doing anything. They're apathetic. You see those who are striving to do the best that they can, but they're being persecuted. You see all the different types of congregations. And so basically that's like 7 categories, if you will, of churches that applies to us today. We can ask the question, what kind of congregation is Margaret Street? Are we like an Ephesus? Are we like a Smyrna? Are we like a Philadelphia? We can identify these things, and that's why we have these written for us. But then, from that point forward, verse 4, he, as I mentioned, sees a glimpse into heaven. Then he starts to see these spiritual battles. Then he sees final judgment. So that's why, if you will, the provocation of why John wrote this down, because Jesus told him to, as well as the things that he saw that he's trying to reveal to us. Now, as we get to the last few, these get more complex and more intense, but we will expand these the best that we can. All right, so number 7 is the purpose. What's the purpose of the book of Revelation? Well, if I could sum it up in one word, and I think everybody who studies the book and truly understands Revelation would probably agree, it is the word encouragement. This book is a book of encouragement. So many people come to Revelation and they're kind of scared of it, or they get frightened because of all the things that they read in there, those beasts and all the different things that they read about, those 4 horsemen and the apocalypse and all that. What they don't understand is that this was written to help Christians have hope, to have assurance, to have comfort and support, and build that hope in those times of struggling and being persecuted. So whenever you look at Revelation, don't look at doomsday predictions. Don't think of it that way. Don't think of it as something frightful and scary and highly mysterious. Don't think of it that way. In fact, imagine yourself as a Christian in the 1st century, and you are being persecuted. And let's just get real serious here. And they catch you, and they put you in jail. And the night before you are to be executed, because that's what they did to Christians, and you see it happening all the time. The night before you are to be executed, somebody walks in and hands you a copy of this letter, this book of Revelation. Think about it. Would it bring you comfort? Whenever you read that in the end God wins, and that whenever you read that his martyrs will be, he will receive judgment, that he is going to annihilate, if you will, he's going to rid us of all problems that we had. In fact, he's making a new place for us, this new Jerusalem that we can be with him. That would comfort you. And so think of it that way, because it is a book of encouragement. All right, it's also a book of victory. You know, God will be victorious in the end, and he is preparing a home for us. It's what Jesus said that he would be doing for us, preparing a place. It's like a mansion with many rooms. And so just knowing that provides hope. You know, if you have a picture in your mind of what you're striving for, what it is that you're fighting for, then you're going to have greater courage to be able to press forward. And that's why we have these pictures, this revelation. I'll tell you what helps me when I look in Revelation chapter 21, verse 4, and he says, "And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no pain, for the former things have passed away." And so it's the perfect end to the Bible. After we read everything that we've read about redemption history, and we see the purpose of this book, it is the perfect culmination of redemption history. It all started in the Garden of Eden, and it all ends at the tree there in that tree of life in chapter 22, verse 22, verse 2, rather. And so that's the purpose of the book. Now, as we have looked at the penman and the place, we looked at the period and the public, the panorama, even the provocation and the purpose. Now we're going to get into something that hopefully will really help you with your study of Revelation, and that is the principles. A bunch of principles that apply when you're studying this book and need to be able to understand this book. And those principles are, number one, God wins in the end. Glorious triumph of Christ and the ultimate victory of righteousness. Now, we typically don't like spoiler alerts whenever we go to movies or want to go see a movie or read a book or something like that. But in this case, when we're talking about eternity and eternal things, we need that. And so, basically, God wins in the end. That's what we need to know. And so what does that do? It provides assurance. It shows us that God is almighty. And so, we need to remember that's one of the main points. God wins in the end. That's, again, going back to the purpose of bringing hope. Now, let me give you some really important points that you need to remember when you're studying the book of Revelation. And that is, number one, always remember that this is a vision. This is prophecy. This is apocalyptic language. I want you to notice that John, who writes this, always uses words like "it seemed like," or "it was like," or "it appeared as," or something like that. What that means is it's not actually what he says. It appeared like that. He's trying to explain things. I want you to put yourself in John's shoes for just a second. I want you to imagine you've seen something that's indescribable. There are no words to describe what you just saw. How are you going to explain this? You're going to use words like, well, it was like this, and I saw what seemed to be like this, had this appearance. Of course, we're not going to know until we get there. But that's what John's trying to do. So don't try to make all of the symbols that you read, try to make them literal or actual, because they're not. They're meant to be descriptions. And if the meaning or the symbol is not clear in good biblical research, it's not consistent with Scripture, then don't assume that it's something else. Don't assume that that symbol means something that the Bible doesn't say that it is. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. And don't be afraid of the symbols. Don't be afraid of the beast. Don't be afraid of the mark of the beast or the four horsemen or anything like that. They're just symbols. They're just imagery to help you see and know and understand the book of Revelation more clearly. Number two, that brings us to the idea that we need to use the Bible as its own commentary. Here's a simple truth. As I mentioned, you need to know all of the Bible really to understand Revelation. The many symbols and the figures and the prophecies and all that we see, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of those are found in the prophets. Those beasts with the wings and the eyes and stuff like that, that's in Isaiah. And all kinds of different things that we see in Ezekiel and Joel and even in the Psalms. As I mentioned, more than 300, as many as 500 references in these prophets. Now, think about that. Early Christians would understand that if they received the book of Revelation, because they grew up, they knew the scriptures, they knew the Old Testament, they were familiar with that language. So this wasn't something that was unfamiliar or strange to them like it is to many of us. But they immediately recognized, oh, this is from the Old Testament. And that's how we need to look at this as well. Now, when you consider also that the last verses of most of the chapters, when it introduces these symbols and things like that, when I said use the Bible as its own commentary, well, the fact is, a lot of times the Bible will explain exactly what it is. I'll show you some of those in just a moment. The other principle that you need to take with you in your study and understand in your study, and we've made this point already a little bit, and that is that it was written for first century Christians. That often helps explain the context and provides better understanding whenever you're studying the book of Revelation. See, it was written again during a time when Christians were being harassed, and that era of persecution that we see beginning all the way back in Acts chapter 4 continued all the way up until the 4th century, until Emperor Constantine finally put an end to it. So this book was very useful, if you will, for Christians for 3 or 4 centuries there. Still useful to us today, but especially those first few centuries of intense persecution. And as we mentioned earlier, those 7 churches. So it was written for first century Christians. So those are 3 points I've given you so far. I hope that you'll remember in your studies. That this is vision, is prophecy. Use the Bible as its own commentary, and it was written for new Christians. Here's another really important one that a lot of people don't understand. It is progressive teaching. Reoccurrence in its teaching. So what happens is that John, or in the Revelation, it will talk about one particular subject from, say, the beginning to final judgment, and then it'll start over from the beginning to final judgment again, or it'll back up, if you will. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. It'll back up and start over again. And so a lot of people don't understand that. I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment when we get to the plan part of this, where we break down the chapters, and I can show you how that works. And so what we need to understand in that is when we study the book of Revelation, that not everything lines up one right after the other, and a lot of people make that mistake. So remember also that Jesus, whenever he taught, he used more than one parable to explain the kingdom of God. So why wouldn't he use more than one way to explain the visions or give more than one vision to John so that he could explain these things to us and to Christians? And then, as we have mentioned already once, is that about this being vision and prophecy, the other thing, the 5th point I want you to understand whenever you are studying Revelation, that it is full of symbolism. All kinds of symbolism. Now, one of the things that stands out are the numbers. One of the first things that people notice about the book of Revelation are the numbers. Now, for example, the number 7. That's probably the most important number that's found. It's found some 55 times in the book. And most people understand this, but some don't. And that number 7 means complete. It means perfect. It means all-inclusive, this fullness, this absolutely. So if you stop and think about it, 3, the number 3, that's used to denote the deity of God. You have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. All right, that's a number that appears multiple times in hundreds of scriptures to talk about the sacred Godhead. And so if you have 3, and then you have 4, which is the 4 corners of the earth, north, east, south, and west, there you have 7, which encompasses deity and all of mankind. That's how some people like to explain the number 7. Then you also have the number 12. You see that a lot, and that's a number that's multiplied by 3, that deity, and by 4, the creation and the work. And so the Bible uses it to represent the people of God. And then probably the most famous number in Revelation is the number 666. Everybody knows that number. And they just love that number because it's such a scary one. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Now, in symbolism, they also need to understand that this is a lot of imagery. It's a lot of figurative language. You have beasts and dragons and martyrs and horses and lambs and lions. Again, it's figurative language, and it's all for dramatic effect to help you understand and know Revelation a little better, to remember. Now, we remember songs easier than we think about this. It is easier to remember a song than it is to memorize a verse. But if you take that verse and put it in a song, you remember it. Well, it's the same way in Revelation using this imagery. You're going to remember those things more so than if he were just to use plain language. Let me give you some examples. Go to chapter 5, Revelation chapter 5, verse 8, and you see some of this imagery there. It says in Revelation chapter 5, "Now when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb." And in my version of the Bible, that Lamb, the capital L is, or Lamb has a capital L. It says, "Each having a harp, golden bowls of incense, which are the prayers of the saints, and they sang a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll." And again, he's called this Lamb. Now let me ask you a question. This is obviously talking about Jesus, because if you continue to read, it talks about the sacrifice that he made and all the different things that he did. It's clearly Jesus. Is Jesus really a lamb? Is he actually physically a lamb? Well, no, and we know that. We understand that it's just a description of who Jesus is. Jesus was a human being. He was not a lamb. And so we clearly, when we see that kind of language, we don't think twice about it being, that's figurative language. Jesus is not an actual lamb. He's a real person, but it describes his character. It describes who he is. Now look in verse 5, because in verse 5, it also describes Jesus using a different word. There it says, "But one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and loose its 7 seals." There we see clearly we're talking about Jesus, the Son of God. And so it's obvious that you use words like lion and lamb to describe Jesus, but it doesn't mean that's what he actually is. Now go ahead and flip over to chapter 12. Chapter 12, he uses another description, and in this description, verse 3, it says, "Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head." And so we see this picture and we go, "Oh no, this horrible imagery, this dragon," and we get scared. But look in verse 9. Look in verse 9. "So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan." And so what we see here, this is imagery that John is using, or that was given to him through this revelation, to describe Satan. Satan is seen as a dragon, where Jesus was seen as a lamb. We didn't really have a problem thinking about Jesus as a lamb, but yet here we see that Revelation uses this imagery to describe Satan. And this goes on and on and on. And that's, with that mindset, we need to approach things like, and I know you've heard this 1,000 times for some of you who study the Bible for many years, in Revelation chapter 7, go with me to Revelation chapter 7. Here's one of those famous numbers. Revelation chapter 7, verse 4 says, "And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 140,000 of all the tribes of Israel were sealed." And then if you keep your finger there and go over to chapter 14, chapter 14, verse 1, you see it again. Then I looked, and behold, a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 140,000 having his Father's name written on their foreheads. You know that there's doctrine out there that people say they are a part of that 144,000. Well, again, if you think about imagery and you think about symbolism, in chapter 7, it immediately after that gives you all the tribes. It says how many people were taken out of the tribes. And so really, if you want to be a part of that 144,000, you need to be of the tribe of Israel. And then I want you to notice in chapter 14, there is that lamb again. Now, we had no problem with the lamb being figurative language, so we know that's figurative language. That's not a real lamb standing there. And standing on Mount Zion, which is also figurative language. And with him, those 140,000. Now, all of a sudden, everybody wants to take that literal and make some doctrine out of it. Makes absolutely no sense. But here's the even more interesting part I find on that. Is in verse 3. It says, and they sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. And these are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. They are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to God of the Lamb. And so when people want to take that number, 144,000, and make it literal, then if we're going to make it literal, then let's take it all the way literal. If that's the case, the only people who can be of that 144,000 according to verse 4 are virgins, male virgins. So sorry, ladies, sorry, married people, sorry, all you other people who don't fit that category, you're not part of the 144,000. You see how ludicrous that becomes whenever you try to carry that idea of making things literal? And so I hope that's a good lesson of why imagery is so important, to look at it with what it means. Now, I have figured out, if you haven't already, that this study is way bigger than 30 or 45 minutes. We've already been going 45 minutes and just now getting to these points about these different symbols. And so what I'd like to do is next week, we're going to talk about the mark of the beast. We're going to talk about the four horsemen specifically. We're going to talk about Armageddon and all those scary characters, and how people take the book of Revelation and they want to manipulate it to say things that it doesn't. So this lesson tonight was more to give you an overview about what the book is and what it's about. And next week, I want to dive into those specific characters so we can spend a little bit more time and give you some biblical reference, as we did just now with some of these symbols and this figurative language, so that you can have a better understanding of the book of Revelation. So between this lesson and next week's lesson, you should be able to study the book of Revelation without any fear or worry, and grow from it and learn from it, and let it be that hope of encouragement, hope and encouragement for you. And so we still have to show you the plan, that is the breakdown, the outline of the book, as well as the principal passages. But as I said, we've been going now for about 45 minutes, and I just want to say thank you to each of you who joined in tonight, both on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live, and we also put this on our main website. Sorry about the audio at the beginning. I'll try to remember not make that mistake next time. And next time, I hope to also have a few slides that will help in the teaching process. So once again, thank you for being with us here, being with me this evening. I hope this has been beneficial to you. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you too much with information, but giving you just some basic knowledge of the book of Revelation that you can take and use with you next time. Until next time, thank you and God bless.